we go. So my talk today will be about, as Phil already introduced, about digital analytics, GA4 and the state of data and privacy in 2023. This has been a topic, I think, in the analytics space for quite a long time, for quite a while. And I feel like it's good every once in a while to sort of give you all an update on this. GA4 has been released. We've had a lot of progression in the field of tag management and Google Tag Manager specifically. So I think today I want to give you guys a bit of an update on where we stand and what the possibilities are with those tools. But before I do that, I would always like to sort of go back in time and look at where the digital analytics world really was when I started in this business more than 10 years ago. And it's these kinds of files that I used to work with. So if at the time I wanted to do analysis on how a web page was performing or behaved, this is the kind of file that I would ask my server guy or my IT guy to get me. And he would deliver me a file from the servers with usually a timestamp, some sort of page or URL that was visited, and you could sort of see and you had to analyze for yourself or make yourself out how a session looked like or how a page looked like. And nobody at the time really cared about, hey, there's an IP address in there, and we might want to be careful with that because it links back to maybe a specific person. At the time, nobody really, at least in my view, nobody was really busy with that. And I think it's nice to sort of look back at how that goes. And these days, things have changed a bit, right? And I like this. I like this image because it sort of shows how marketeers or people in the digital marketing world sort of like people to be. Hey, don't worry, it's only our personal data that they're collecting so they can show us more relevant advertising. That's how they want people to think. And in some cases, that's actually true, but most of the times, this is not really how that works. And in order to sort of protect people, GDPR came along in the European Union, and there's a UK equivalent, and in other countries it's something similar popped up, which was used to protect people and making it very clear that privacy and consent should be important, and it gives us laws and regulations on how we can use or process personal data, or how we can store it, what we define as personal data, and also to who it applies. And so it applies to basically all organizations within the EU. But the interesting thing is, if you're, for example, based in the US, you're a US organization, even then, if you collect information about EU citizens, you still need to comply with these guidelines. So even if you're not European as a company, you still need to apply. You still need to comply with this as long as you're collecting data from EU citizens. And I think this is a really interesting way to think about it, and it's a really interesting that this came along. This was in 2018, which has been quite a while, and I think the biggest impact of this is what we've seen quite recently, especially in the Google Analytics sort of sphere. Tele2, by origin a Swedish company, were fined over $1.1 million only a few months ago for breaching those GDPR rules. So they were breaching those GDPR rules. They were fined $1.1 million. And the reason why is because they did an audit on how they implemented Google Analytics. It came out that they were not following the guidelines as set in GDPR, and as a result, they got this huge fine. And even though this is not something we've seen quite often, it does show how important it is to actually comply with those rules and to adhere to those guidelines in order to make sure that you're not next. And something else in the digital analytics field happened quite recently. I'm sure I'm not the first speaker today that is talking about this. I think this probably came back in almost every talk. But as of July 1, universal analytics sort of died. And I'm saying sort of because for quite some people and quite some accounts, it's still sort of working and it's still processing data. But it sort of died, and it gave rise to a number of questions that companies got. Hey, we need to migrate to GA4, but is GA4 really the best tool for us? Or hey, if we're reevaluating our digital analytics stack, do we need to move to a competitor? What does it mean in terms of privacy? It gave rise to a lot of questions. And so that means that me as a freelancer, I got a lot of questions as well from companies saying, what should I do? It's not as easy to implement GA4. Should I move to a different tool? It was really difficult for a lot of organizations. I've learned to decide, hey, where should we go next? So that's as a bit of an introduction. My name is Kevin. I'm a freelance specialist in data and analytics and tech management. I have a computer science and psychology background, which I think is fairly important to this. I like to be sort of in the mix between, on the one hand, IT people, psychology people, marketing people, and I like to be sort of in the middle of that. I have over 10 years of experience in the analytics and data field. And as Phil already mentioned, I'm the co-founder of MeasureCam Amsterdam. So if you're free next year in April or May, make sure to mark that in your calendars. And some of the clients I've worked for, big banks, but also retail companies, theme parks, and governments. And today, I want to discuss privacy and Google Analytics 4. So, Universal Analytics is done. Somehow we need to move somewhere, and I want to take you guys along today on how to implement GA4, but how to implement it in a privacy friendly manner, and discuss the different elements that I think are important in order to do so. And for me, if you want to implement GA4 in a privacy-friendly manner, there's 3 different elements that come into play and that are important. On the one hand, it's around data collection. So, hey, I want GA4 to collect data of people on my website. How should I implement that, or what should I do? And then secondly, if you're implementing GA4 through a tag management system, how can that tag management system actually help to implement it correctly, track the data that we need or that we want to collect, and how does it help you gain better control? And then third and finally, GA4 itself. And GA4 has a lot of different settings as well that helps you control the data that's in there, and what can you do in GA4 to better control that data. And I want to take you guys along those 3 points and dive into each one specifically to give you guys an overview or insights into how to implement GA4. And so that starts with data collection. When is the data collected, and what I think is very important here, and a question often forgot, is did the user actually consent to collecting data? Short disclaimer: I'm not a lawyer. I'm the data guy, so I want to urge that I'm not here to give any legal advice or anything like that. But I do think I know enough about the legislation and the rules to give advice on it. And I think if you look at the regulations, it's actually not that unclear. And it says here very specifically, if you're using social media advertising and you're tracking either with tracking pixels or beacons or JavaScript, you need to get consent from your users. They need to give consent in order for you to track them. Same thing for online advertising. If you're using some sort of online advertising service and you're sending data to that service or to that vendor, you need to get consent in order for you to be able to do that. So you need to be very clear and very specific with this. And the same applies to analytics. So cross-device tracking or analytics in general. Also here, in theory, you need to ask for consent. It's not strictly necessary to have analytics or to have cross-device tracking or anything like that for a website or something to work. So it's not strictly necessary in terms of functionality to have that. And the rules per country are a little bit different. So this is not the guidelines in each country are a bit different. So in the Netherlands, for example, there's a slight difference here. But all in all, this is how it works. And for users, this is very important. So it says very clearly, 71% of users in a study by McKinsey said they would stop doing business with a company if it gave away sensitive data without permission. So if companies knew, if users knew that you were using their data without consent, they would trust you less, and so they would less likely do business with you. And this makes a lot of sense. If you go into a regular store and they know, you know that they're lying to you, you're probably also not buying there. And the same sort of applies online. And so if we know all of this, and if all of this is common sense, then my biggest question here is, why are still so many companies failing at this? Why is this going so wrong? So here is an example of a UK grocery shop online. You can buy your groceries there. You go to the website, and the first thing you see is a consent banner saying your privacy is important to us. They tell you specifically, we think this is important. And without accepting or without declining, without doing anything at all, your data is being sent to Adobe, your data is being sent to Google, and all of your cookie data identifiers are sent along without giving consent. This is Sky, maybe very well known. Same thing. I load the website. The first thing I get is a cookie banner asking me what my cookie preferences are. I haven't done anything. I haven't even moved my mouse yet, and still my data is being passed to Google, to Adobe, to Facebook, and to a whole bunch of other services. And again, I did not give consent here for Sky to send that data to a third party. And at the same time, they're still doing this. I also think, I also have a Dutch example that I think is very nice that I want to show you. So here I go to a website called Telegraaf, which is a Dutch newspaper website. I go to the website, I get a cookie banner here as well. I can either agree with them setting cookies, or I can give them my preferences. And the button below says I agree or disagree. And without doing anything, the way it should be is that no data is being sent to Google or to Adobe or anything like that. And I press I disagree. I don't want to be tracked by anything. And it still shows no data has been sent. And so this is all very nice. So I open up a news article. I browse around a little bit, and the funny thing is still nothing happens. There's still no advertising or analytics loaded or anything. But then I refresh the page. All of a sudden, I have to either agree or disagree with push messaging, which I don't want. But at the same time, now all of a sudden, behind my back, they've loaded a bunch of advertising tools. All of a sudden, they've sent my data to Google Analytics and to various other vendors. And so, what's going on here, really? This article was from 2020, 3.5 years ago, more than that. And it already at the time, it said that consent tools are just being used to undermine privacy rules. Yeah? You can show that you're caring about privacy, but you really aren't. And I think Brian Clifton at Super Week in 2020, he gave a very nice presentation. And if you can go ahead and look it up, a very nice presentation going into this in even more detail about the different kinds of consents that they gave, and also how a lot of companies failed at this. And I don't understand how it's possible that it's 2023. GDPR rules, cookie consent rules have been alive for more than 5 years, and we still fail at this. And I think it's either knowingly or unknowingly. I've seen clients that knowingly did this, that knowingly sort of moved around consent that people gave. But I've also seen quite a lot of companies that did this unknowingly, that simply did not have the technical capabilities in order to implement a tech manager or an analytics tool in such a way that it adheres to consent laws. And a lot of these companies have consent management systems. In the examples that I gave, all of them, they have a specific tool that they have a license for in order to adhere to consent. But that is not a guarantee for adhering to consent regulations. And it's not a one-time task. I've seen this a lot as well, where they've once back in 2019, they've implemented it, and at the time it probably worked, but nobody maintained it, nobody documented it, and so by now it's simply not working anymore. And I think this is the first and very key step in implementing GA4 correctly. It has nothing to do with GA4 itself. It has nothing to do with anything by Google. Basically, it's making sure that you adhere to consent. I think this is the most important part, actually. Then secondly, my second part of implementing GA4 in a privacy friendly manner is about Google Tag Manager. And in Google Tag Manager, very recently, they've implemented something called Google Consent Mode. And in theory, that sounds awesome. It really does. It sort of connects with your consent management system. And if you implement your consent management system correctly, and you implement Google Tag Manager and GA4 in a default manner, they sort of work very well together. And Google claims that by doing so, you automatically adhere to all of the GDPR rules and regulations. But is it really? And I, to be honest, I think it's interesting at the very least to know what's going on in the background. So here is the documentation of what actually happens if your consent management system tells Google Tag Manager that you denied or that you did not give analytics consent. And then at the back of it, Google will send cookieless pings to Google Analytics for future measurement, and Google Analytics 4 will use cookieless pings for modeling. And so what this means is that there's no cookie data being sent along, and the idea is that that's where your personal identifiable information is. But at the same time, they still send along a user ID if you've set that, and they still send along an IP address. So is that really GDPR friendly? I think it's at least up for discussion. In the old days, back in the universal analytics days, you had to set a specific setting in your tags in order for Google Tag Manager to anonymize your IP address or the user's IP address before it was sent to Google Analytics. And in GA4, this is done by default. So you no longer need to do this. Analytics does not log any IP addresses anymore. So before you had to do this manually, now all of this goes automatically by default. Also, new in GA4 is that all of the data that's being collected for devices in the EU is also stored at EU servers. So instead of the data automatically going to the US, the data is first forwarded and through the main servers in the EU. Another feature that's not necessarily new for GA4, it already existed back in the Universal Analytics days, is something called Google Signals. And Google Signals, if you ask Google, helps in order to more accurately get cross-device reporting. It helps you create better remarketing audiences, and it gives you access to demographic and interest data, so age and gender, in your reports. And while this is very nice, you're not really necessarily allowed to do that unless you get consent. And so in GA4, in Google Tag Manager, you have a number of fields that you can set, allow Google Signals and allow ad personalization signals that you can set as a variable in order for you to sort of enable or disable Google Signals for those that gave either consent or no consent for it. So by setting these, regardless really of how you set it in the interface, you can sort of override your settings here for specific users. And you can do this in Google Tag Manager, you can do this in Telium, you can do this in basically every tag management system that exists. So this is all client-side Google Tag Manager, but also a few years ago, Google launched server-side Google Tag Manager. And I think if you even better want to control what data is being passed to GA4, a server-side Google Tag Manager implementation can really help you achieve this. And just to sort of as a little bit of background, so in the old days, you had your client-side Google Tag Manager that was forwarding your data and sending requests to Google Analytics. With server-side Google Tag Manager, your tag management lives in the cloud. So you go from your client-side tag manager to your server-side, and then from there, server side, the calls are made to GA. And because the data gets into your cloud, and Google Tag Manager offers, server side Google Tag Manager offers quite a lot of other ways to control the data, it can really help. So here as well, you can, for example, enable Google Signals or disable it. You can override or determine whether the IP address needs to be tracked. This is all possible here. And what I think is a very interesting new feature also in this space is what's called transformations. And so in GTM server side, you have ways with which you can say, okay, this is a parameter that I know contains information that I don't want to pass along to GA4. And so you can say, okay, I want to exclude that. Or I want to modify an event before it's being passed on to, for example, GA4. And it gives you a lot of freedom and a lot of control in order for Google Tag Manager to work and for the data that's being sent to GA4. So some takeaways. I think if you want to implement GA4 in a privacy-friendly manner, a tag management solution like Google Tag Manager can really help. Clients like Google Tag Manager offers quite some ways to adhere to the consent the users give. You need to know which parameters you need to set and how these work, but once you do, it works. I think Google Consent Mode in its essence works very nice, but it doesn't necessarily guarantee a privacy-minded implementation. And in server-side Google Tag Manager, you have basically the same features as in the client, with extra benefits for even more control of the data that you're sending. And then last, I want to dive into GA4. In GA4, you have a lot of different settings you can use as well. So I'd like to go through them as well. Some of the settings on a account level, like these, they are obvious, but I've seen them often being overlooked. So make sure to implement and set these correctly. Don't just allow certain settings. For example, here for the advertising settings, you can specify for which region you want to set it. So in the EU or for European countries, you might want to set those differently than for other countries. Make sure to also not just acknowledge or agree with certain settings, because they will have implication on the way your data is being collected and what data is being collected. One thing that I've also seen go wrong quite often is linking with BigQuery. So I've seen a lot of clients that accidentally link their data with a US stored a BigQuery table, which if you do, well, obviously then that does not necessarily apply to GDPR rules either. And I think a very important aspect in privacy regulations is retention. So you can set the retention period in GA4 the way you want it. But make sure that you follow here the guidelines that exist as well. And so you can set it to 13 months, but are you really allowed to save your data for 13 months? I think it's a valid check to do if you don't know before, because an analyst might think, yeah, 2 months of data, it's really not enough for my use case, and I can't work with 2 months. And setting it to 13 months is just picking a different option in the dropdown, but it's not that easy. You might want to overthink what the implications are if you do so in terms of privacy. So GA4 or Google Analytics in general has quite a lot of different options, but they're not necessarily easy to find. So you need to know what you're looking at. don't just accept or acknowledge things or tick check marks without knowing what's behind it is, I think, very important as well. So those are the three sort of steps that I think are important. The one is on consent that people give in terms of cookie consent. The second is in Google Tag Manager, where you can set a lot of different steps to control your data. And third, in GA4. And before I leave it to any questions, I want to run through some things that are I want you guys to consider. And this is, I think, a very interesting one. The title here says "The accident sits in a small corner," which I think is very funny. It's a Dutch saying. So in Dutch, this actually makes a lot of sense. In English, it doesn't. But it means that even in a small corner, in a small area, you can find quite big accidents. And I think this is an example of that, where a website was fined for using Google Fonts. So they loaded their fonts through a Google server, and that means that each time a user loaded a page with that font, a call had to be made to Google with an IP address in order to retrieve the font that was necessary to show the page. And obviously, a user does not necessarily give consent for sending an IP address over to Google in order to load fonts. So even with something relatively small, like a Google font or a font in general, you can already be in trouble. And I think this really shows that. I also want to end with a few conclusions here. The first one is privacy is never really finished. You're not done when you implement a consent management system. You need to work on it. You need to keep active work on how it's implemented. And as an analyst, I think we have a certain responsibility, right? We should know what data is being collected. We should know for what purpose it's being collected. And we can't just blindly use data or send it over to some marketing tool because we just like a lot of data. There needs to be a purpose, and we need to know that it was collected with consent of users. And so knowing what data you're collecting and for what purpose, I think is vital. And I think what really helps there is documentation. And I've only seen a very few clients, it's very rare that they actually document what data they collect against what purpose. But I think that really helps. And so audit your analytics and data collection setup regularly in order to prevent things going wrong, in order to prevent privacy flaws like we've seen in the last half hour. Make sure that you run through your analytics setup, run through your tech management setup and your consent in order to find any issues that have arisen. And don't think you're done once you've set it up. And the big question here, I think, and that's where I want to end with, does this make GA4 legal? And the debate is long and complicated, and it really depends who you ask. But there's hope. So there's been a lot of updates on this very recently that I think you guys should read. You guys should read through, and there's hope that hopefully in the future those legality issues are going to be gone. Thank you very much. I think Phil, you're already waiting for me here. Thank you very much. And if there's any questions, let me know.
Yes, there's two questions. We've got roughly about 5 minutes. And it's very it's pertinent in the sense that there's a lot of vendors that say that it's not possible to set GA4 into a kind of compliant mode. Like it's just a bit fiddly to do so. And it's kind of there's a lot of settings that people don't necessarily realize or know about, and a few kind of gotchas. I wasn't aware of that Google Fonts one. That's a new one. Yeah, I think because it's still, is it 4% of global revenue for GDPR fine, I'm guessing. So
yes, so yeah, be careful about that. And I think people underestimate the impact as well.
Yeah, well, not, and also brand damage, not just the fine.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm just jumping to Q&A. There's two questions in there. So someone's asked, where can we learn about the parameters needed to set on GTM client side? So these were the two parameters.
Yeah, they allow Google signals and they allow for ad personalization. They're actually, if you search for them in the Google documentation, they are documented. It's just that you need to know they exist if you want to find them. But they are in the documentation. So make sure to if you search for them in the Google Docs or somewhere, I'm sure you should be able to find them.
Yeah, and George has asked, so is consent mode not GDPR compliant? Is that what you're suggesting? I mean, especially in single page applications where the client ID doesn't change since the page never reloads.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it also depends here as well. It depends who you ask. Like, there's a lot of even specialists like me who sort of say it's not GDPR friendly. If you ask, for example, Brian Clifton, he has a very interesting article about that, and he's very clear about it, saying no. I think the question here, the question here is twofold. On the one hand, if you read through the specifics, is it legal or not? On the other hand, you can also wonder if I, as a user, does not give consent for tracking, would you want to track me? So even if it's with consent mode on, if I don't give consent, should you, on the back of it, sort of sneaky, still want to send data to a Google server, even if I told you specifically you shouldn't? So I think there's the technical answer here, and there's the ethical answer here, and it's up for every company or client or person individually how to deal with that. But I think it's in twofold.
Yeah, and I do wonder whether maybe the browsers are going to possibly solve that, square that circle in 6 months' time. Maybe they'll introduce a way of a sort of consent management system, or which allows kind of anonymous pings. So it says technically the answer is the answer no, as in I would say my route would be if you set set GTM and GA4 up in as like privacy as mode as possible, I would say you could probably get away with using pings, but it's really down to your in-house DPO as to what they allow you to do. But I don't know, Kevin, if you've had, we've got one large client operates in Europe that what they've done on consent motives, they've actually on Google Analytics, which has got the consent mode modeling for analytics, ad storage and analytics, and they've actually added the additional consent fields, which kind of basically disables pings. So it's kind of they're using consent mode as in the framework for consent mode, but just not using the pings part of it. But they then lose the 15% upscaling of opt-outs, which is like that was the whole point of it. So
That's the whole point of using Google Signals in the first place. So then I wonder, what are you doing it for? You know, what's the purpose?
Yeah, they're hoping
going through the hassle.
Yeah, they're hoping that the DPO will allow it. In the UK, we drop out of GDPR in 3 months' time. So there's in theory, cookie banner is going to disappear in the UK. Then,
well, not technically, because if you're a UK-based company and you're still serving a website to EU-based people, then you're actually not allowed to remove that consent banner, because as a European citizen, I'm still entitled to that choice regardless of where the company is based.
Yeah, actually that is true. So I mean, it'd be UK GeoIPs is what I mean. But
Yeah.
there's a bunch more questions here. It's getting quite kind of heated sort of thing. Kevin, what I'll do, I'll email you these questions, and if people want to kind of answer them in Kumo Space, I'll just put a link to Kumo Space in chat. That's that one, and I'm just also just going to send you these 3 questions. I'll send the full list of questions, and we're also doing speaker survey sort of stuff in roughly, well, 24 hours, and then 7 days after that. Thank you again for doing that talk, Kevin. Lots of interesting technical takeaways there. And I think George definitely wants to chat, because I think he's got lots of questions. So I'm going to just take presenter control for a second. Okay, as I said, if people could fill in the feedback form, and then in 24 hours time, we're going to add the links to the slides. So that's going to be on the thank you page of the feedback. If you want us to continue the discussions with Kevin, jump over into Kumo Space.